listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I am your host, Ange, and welcome you to episode number 26. Today, we welcome author Joshua Young, the author of Craving Recovery. This is a unique, special three-part series where I will interview Joshua in this episode about his story and book, and then I will interview his wife, Sasha, about her perspective supporting him, and finally, her own personal trauma story. After a life spent dealing with childhood trauma, depression, and anxiety, Joshua found the answer to his problems by way of alcohol. Joshua finally sought out the help needed to detox safely, openly address the root cause of his drinking, and since regained control over his life. The lessons learned through recovery have taught him to be patient, understanding, and open and honest with his loved ones. Joshua is the author of Craving Recovery, which speaks to this firsthand experience within a treatment facility, myths and stigma, relapse prevention, intervention, lying, withholdings, cravings, dealing with the root cause, and so on. Joshua is passionate about sharing his experience with rehab and therapy and to specifically assist other alcoholics on their road to recovery. Joshua is married with 4 children and has built a career in the finance industry. Now, a little bit about the book, Craving Recovery. Craving Recovery is an open and honest account of alcoholism resulting from childhood trauma and how the disease of alcoholism impacted Joshua's life and his family's. After decades of drinking, recovery was desired, and thus he sought out the help needed to detox safely, to finally open up and address the issue that caused the excessive drinking, and through recovery process restored relationships and improved not only his life, but everyone around him. Craving Recovery not only speaks to the alcoholic, but also to the people dealing with loved one with a drinking problem. For the alcoholic, rehab is glamorized in the media, and there are numerous myths and stigmas attached. Allow Joshua to take you through what it was like for him by the way of his personal firsthand experience. Additionally, what does life after rehab look like? Support groups, therapy, addressing guilt and shame, identifying and dealing with the root cause of the problem, alcohol cravings, triggers, your sober social life, relapse prevention, and living a happy and fulfilling life in sobriety. For the loved one dealing with the problem drinker, alcoholism is a family disease. Joshua walks through the process of communicating with loved ones, intervention, and available options. Additionally, he addresses how to recognize the traits of an alcoholic, lying, withholding, support groups, and most importantly, how sobriety can change the life of your loved one, your family, and yours for the better. This episode includes sensitive topics. If you feel it may be triggering to you, then we encourage you to listen to the episode in a therapeutic community to ensure you are safe and supported. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee, sit back, and let's get started. Good morning, listeners. This is Ange, and I am very excited on this Saturday morning, although I'm not a morning person. So Saturday morning episodes, I have to be really excited in order to do them. I'm very excited to have another author of our book club series. This one is on a hot topic for many of us recently, and it deals with addiction. So we're going to talk about recovery. It's the author of the book, Craving Recovery, Joshua Young. And Joshua, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and just kick off and tell us why you're here today. Go for it.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Ange, for having me. First off, when I was in rehab, I did all the normal stuff and things and all the treatment and stuff. And then I get out of the rehab and I'm going, now what? What do I do now? And I didn't know how to live my life. I didn't know who to talk to. And the biggest problem that I have was I didn't have the skills and the coping mechanisms to live my life beyond rehab. And that was kind of the issue. I was talking at an AA meeting, and I was telling my story about, I was sexually abused as a child, but never talked about it, attempted suicide, had a major depression, did all these things, and then turned to alcohol to help me sleep at night so I wouldn't have these horrible, intrusive thoughts. And I was sharing this story in a rehab or in an AA meeting. And the interesting thing was, while I was telling the story, I started getting pinged, ping, 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 all these messages from people saying, this is such a great story. You need to share it more. You need to really get the story of recovery out there and how you dealt with your root cause and all these types of things. So I said, nah, I'm not a writer. This isn't what I do. This is not what I don't do this. What are you talking about? Well, you really should. And I was like, okay. The very next meeting, I was on it, and it was a Zoom call, and getting pinged from the same people again, over and over and over again. Did you start your book? No, no, no. So I started writing some notes. I said, let me just try it. So I started writing, doing this whole thing, and I got to about 30 pages. I said, maybe there's something here. And I talked to my wife, and I said, I'm thinking about writing a book. And one of the things that I did while in rehab is, my very first day, I kept the house manager said, one of the things that helped me, and he had been sober for 15 years, was keeping a journal. And I said, oh gosh, a journal. My wife does that. That's a girl thing. I don't do that. What are you talking about? And he goes, just give it a try. Again, one of the benefits of journaling that he had told me was part of recovery is replacing a negative habit with a positive one. Journaling can become that. And I said, okay, I don't even know what to write. He gave me a list of prompts and stuff. And I said, great. So now I said, hey, I'm here in rehab in the facility to do the work. If you're telling me this might work, great. I didn't realize that 5 years later, I'd be journaling every day. I journaled this morning. And what I did was I kept every little thing that I saw, everything that I did, every rule that was given to us, how I felt. I kept myself accountable for all the things that I had to do, celebrated my small wins day by day by day. And then I realized, wow, this could actually make into a book about all the things that I went through. And that was kind of the spirit behind and really the genesis of the book, Craving Recovery. And that's because I was craving it. I wanted to recover. I wanted to get better. Now, how was my recovery in the past? Well, let's see. I tried to kill myself. Well, that didn't help my recovery from the sexual abuse. I tried to, well, let's see, let's try cocaine. Well, that didn't help out. It just made me more crazy about it. Tried pot, tried all the different little things. And then I found alcohol one day. I said, wow, I slept pretty damn good last night. This is good. And when I was sexually abused, when I was between the ages of 13 to 14 by a man who I had trusted, my parents didn't know. There was no GPS. There was no, hey, it was basically be home when the lights are on type of thing back in the, early 80s. So at that point, it was like, wow, I'll just be free during my day. This guy said, hey, I'm going to help you train you, get ready for football and do all this kind of stuff. You're starting high school next year. And it started out normal. Just, hey, I'm going to train you, get you worked out, do this whole thing. And it was great. And then it turned into, hey, let me just measure your muscles. You know what? Hey, you need to get a good massage after your workout. And then it was, let's take our shirts off. And then it turned into one thing led to another. And it was painful. It was horrible. I had nightmares for 4 decades, and labeled this gentleman as, I shouldn't even say gentleman, more of a predator, absolute predator, as my shadow monster, because I've always felt he was lurking. I was talking to my therapist recently, Ange, and I said, gosh, was this the reason why I'm such a cautious driver, always looking in my rearview mirror and my side view mirror? She goes, yeah, it's part of the psyche now. You're always searching. Is he out there staring at you? Is he looking? Is he in the bushes somewhere? And this abuse went on in my life for 1.5 years, and it was brutal. And I didn't tell anybody. I was ashamed. And he told me, hey, people are going to find out you're gay. I'm not gay. You're making me do this. I'm not choosing to do this. Why didn't you say no? So there's a lot of stigmas attached to that, shame and guilt over the years. But as my drinking became a tool to help me numb myself at night so I could sleep, so the thoughts of suicide, the thoughts of this guy wouldn't jump in my head, it got progressively worse and worse and worse. I realized I was killing myself. And I had a daughter who's now married. I wanted to be able to walk her down the aisle. I wanted to see my sons play high school football. I knew I was killing myself. So I craved the recovery. And that's the really kind of the point of the story is you really got to want it for yourself, not for others. You got to want it for yourself.
I love that. I'm thinking of a few things. So many of the listeners know, or if the listeners who've heard all of the episodes know that in August of 2020, I was kidnapped and held hostage for 5 days and escaped. And I dealt with that in a very similar way because I had debilitating nightmares and did not sleep for 6 months and dealt with that with drinking from the moment I woke up until the morning I went to bed. And hence why I met the other Joshua on this podcast who was on episode 10. And it was exactly that, to just figure out how to not have the nightmares, how to have, it was my solution at that point. However, it was not a solution because it didn't solve the problem. And I know that when I went into treatment, I was very lucky in the treatment center that I went into because they immediately knew that I had severe trauma, and I was assigned with a clinical director, and they began working on my trauma and not just the problem or the solution that I had chosen, because I am like really highly functioning at figuring out really cool solutions to my problems that are awful. And so I transitioned from one, much like you, I didn't select cocaine and things like that. I did self-harm and suicidality and eating disorders and things like that. However, the ability to address the trauma for me sped up my recovery. And I was reading your book, in one part, you talk about when they did your entry into the rehab and they asked you the question about, did you have any sexual trauma? You, of course, said no. And I believe there are many, many, many listeners who can relate to that because of guilt and shame and fear. And because of that idea that was placed by the shadow monster, I love that name for it, so appropriate, put into your head. So can you maybe share a little bit about how did you move past that? Like, how did you go from the period of understanding that in order for you, it's one thing to crave recovery and then another thing to crave it so much and then be able to actually reach it. So how did you make that bridge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm asked about it often. I relapsed when I came out. Why? Because I had never addressed the root cause. I knew the root cause. I absolutely knew it. The biggest thing that I had was the stigma attached with being sexually abused. And not necessarily, some people are okay talking about it, but as a man, it was different. The stigma of being sexually abused, really, look, it can make any survivor feel the abuse is happening all over again. I didn't want to talk about it. There is shame and stigma that surrounds sexual abuse, which is ingrained in today's culture. People don't often realize that their actions, reactions, their commentary humiliate sexual assault victims. And that was always my concern. I didn't want to talk about it. And this happens all the time. And the shame and stigma concerning males suffering from sexual abuse further contributes to a society of encouraging toxic masculinity. And sexual abuse, look, in general, it's an uncomfortable subject, but it must not be concealed. And masking these experiences from others promotes the idea that there's something to be embarrassed or ashamed of. And being a survivor of sexual abuse is not something that one should feel they need to hide. Although I did for several decades, as you point out, but I've come to realize that it's a survival experience and one that must be addressed and shared to potentially save another individual. Look, at the end of the day, I was working the steps of AA. And if you're going to properly work the steps and you do your personal inventory and you do all those things and you work properly with a sponsor, I tried to work the program without a sponsor and it was a joke.
I was about to say you were very against AA in the beginning. Classic, no higher power, no God, and no sponsor. I don't have time for this.
Classic. I hear that. I have sponsees today that I tried to do it on my own for a year. I'm very independent. I like to do my own things. The sponsor saved my life, and I still have that sponsor and talk to him today. But the issue that was brought up was going through this, and it was agonizing having to write this down. And he said, you don't even have to tell me. You just got to make the point of writing it down. But look, just like getting into the rehab facility, I wanted this. I wanted it. I wanted to be free. I wanted to feel better. So I sat in the front truck of his car one day. He goes, we typically met for coffee at a coffee place. And we go through the steps and do all the work. And he goes, today, you seem you have a little angst about doing this. Why don't we sit in the trunk the truck of my car, and we'll just sit there and have a cup of coffee, and we can go through it, share what you want, share what you don't. And I could tell and knew something was coming on. I could see his posture change. And I told him, look, this is what happened when I was a kid. You're the first human being in 40 years I've told this story to. And at the end, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe out of body experience. I just told another human being what occurred during that time frame. And he looked at me and said, okay, wow, sorry that you went through that. Look, I'm not a licensed therapist. Sounds like you probably need one. All right, let's move on to the next step. And I was like, dude, did you not hear what I just said? Don't you have follow-up questions? Come on, there's got to be more. Do you want to call the cops? Is there something going on here? And it was just, we started working the next step. And I felt so comfortable and so at ease and so relieved that I went home and told my wife the story. And she was, obviously much more empathetic and much more caring and loving. And she certainly had follow-up questions and things like that. But literally that next morning, we together found a therapist who dealt with men with addiction problems that had been sexually abused. And it was life-changing. And I can't recommend therapy. You got to find the right therapist. And we looked through several, we interviewed several, and we found the one that was the right fit for me. And that's how I kind of came out.
So I have a few comments on this. First off, we talk about this topic a lot on episode 6, which is demystifying and destigmatizing sex addiction. And we talk about how many sex addicts started out as victims of sexual abuse as children. And that we also talk about it later in the link between childhood trauma and addiction in that episode. And the fact that in our heads, we are the only ones, we are awful, we are horrific. In the episode where we're talking about sex addiction, it's so common when you go to share with your sponsor these horrific things, and you're just waiting for them to say, oh my gosh, you're going to burn in hell for the rest of your life. I'm the worst person on the planet. And then the person says, I've heard this and worse. I love in the book when you're telling your story and you're in your AA meeting and you're telling your drunk log and everyone looks at you and you're like, yeah, so what? And move on to the next one. And the beauty in that is not to minimize your pain or your agony or whatnot, but to say that there is a community of other individuals who get it. There's a community, and finding that community and being with those individuals who have been there, who have heard it, who know the path towards a craving recovery and actually getting recovery, surrounding yourselves with those individuals, whatever program it looks like, whether it's AA or one of the many other ones, is so vital. And then part of that is, I have to say, Sasha, I'm not sure if her real name is Sasha or not, but Sasha sounds absolutely amazing. I would love to one day sneak her onto the podcast, because oftentimes what I find is it's really challenging for the spouse to be as supportive as she clearly was. You guys did a phenomenal job of researching a treatment center that would help you be successful, and then researching and deciding that particular IOP was not going to be for you, which was fine. And then, as you just mentioned, researching therapists, which is exactly it. I say to individuals all the time, it goes back to, you didn't go to one bar and say you're never going to drink again. If you didn't like the bar, you just went to another bar, right? And the same thing with therapists. You don't go to one therapist and say, I'm never going to go to therapy again, because, I have an amazing therapist right now. He listens to this podcast. So I'll give him a little tweak there. I won't say his name, of course, but I have an amazing therapist right now. But when I moved to California, it took me 6 therapists to find the one that was the amazing therapist for me. So tying back to Sasha, can you maybe talk about that dynamic? And I know you share in the book, you had a lot of guilt because she was so supportive and you had that guilt. So how has that dynamic been? than now? And then maybe what advice would you give to the addict that they could use with their significant other in that situation?
That's, you got a couple of things to unpack there. One, I would want to comment on therapy, finding the right therapist. Sometimes you got to find the right sponsor. My first sponsor wasn't the right one for me. Why? We didn't connect. He was very old school. You're going to call me 5 times a day. You're going to check in. You're going to do this, this, and this. I wanted somebody I could relate to. I'm not a 20-year-old. I'm a 50-year-old man at the time going, look, I need some help. Make some suggestions. Tell me how things work for you. Share your story. Great man, but wasn't a right fit for me. So sometimes we have to go through a few to get to the right person. Sasha was, my rock. Fantastic. I couldn't have asked for a better partner during this. Were we always on the same page? No. Did we fight? Yeah. You and I had talked about this, Ange. My name is Josh. My book is by Joshua. Why? Because when my wife is mad at me, she calls me Joshua. I was called Joshua a lot before writing this book. So I said, let's incorporate that into the book, because I joke about that later, but it wasn't always perfect. There were a lot of really, really tough times, and she stuck it out, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner in that. And look, weren't on the same page a lot of the times. I had gotten let go from my employer, had let me go, and things were uncomfortable. We had to discuss difficult things. But when it came down to it, we love each other. We share a life together. She wanted me to be around for all the important things in her life and the kids' life and everything. It was just one of those things where I happened to have a good partner that didn't say, hey, I quit. I'm in it with you. And, Sasha's had some trauma in her life, which I won't get into because she hasn't given me the okay to say that on this podcast. She wasn't unfamiliar with what I was going through. She had an idea. So she could, show the empathy that was needed for me to get the resources that I needed to have. Now, advice. That's a tricky thing. It's not a one size fits all. Look, for me, and you kind of hit on a couple of those keywords, trauma and guilt and shame and some of those things. Trauma, addiction, really any sexual identity challenges that people have out there. None of this is your fault. Thus, you don't need to feel guilty. And that's one of the biggest things I've learned was allowing me, and in turn allowing others, the ability to speak about their problems without shame. And that's it sometimes takes a kind of getting into the therapist first, or having a good program like AA. And I think it's funny that you say AA in the sense of, I try to tell these crazy stories. Wow, I hid vodka bottles in my toilet tanks because I had my own bathroom so my wife wouldn't hear it, but they had to be plastic bottles because if you flush the toilet, the glass clings around. And I tell this story and everybody's like, yeah, okay, we've heard this 1,000 times. You're part of this community now. You fit in, it's fine. But with that being said, guilt and shame do exist. And I work with a lot of people today, and you have to accurately distinguish guilt and shame because it helps us identify our emotions and what we're dealing with, and thus the actions on the other side that we need to use to address the issue. And a lot of people get confused by this whole guilt and shame thing. And guilt, you probably already know this, but guilt is really the feeling you get when you did something wrong or you perceived you did something wrong, where shame is that feeling that your entire being is wrong, that something is not right, and it may not be even related to a specific behavior or event. And for me, it's always been helpful to talk about from my point of view today, it's helpful for me to talk about my problems first, share my experiences, get that out there. That's why I wrote the book, how I dealt with things, then allow other people to open up about their feelings, and then remind them to focus on the things that they can control. And most importantly, and I had a review on my book that talked about, wow, this really does talk about forgiveness of yourself and practicing self-compassion and self-love and worth, and how important that is. And how do you do that? You got to speak to yourself as if you would a friend. You got to be gentle. You got to celebrate your small wins. You got to set boundaries for yourself. You and I, Ange, are both professionals outside of this podcast. And I don't go to happy hour. My team knows that. I don't go. I don't want to ever put myself in a position where something could be at risk. But part of this whole thing is also keeping that journal for me. That's personal. I keep the journal because it helps me track my wins. It helps me stay accountable. It does all those types of things.
So your book, some of the things I love about your book is you start off with, your book is very much like what it was like, what I did about it, and what it's like now kind of scenario.
Yeah,
and
that's
as it should be.
Yeah.
So, a couple of thoughts in that is one, in your rehab experience, I'll pause for a second. Okay. So, the founders of RAN, part of the reason we started RAN is we were sitting around at a treatment center there for a variety of reasons. And we saw individuals who were working really hard at their recovery and suddenly had to go home because their insurance dropped them. And so we are very passionate about helping individuals who are actively in treatment, working really hard, attending sessions, working with their therapist, doing that. So one thing I have a question for you is, and I have a couple of questions that I'll pack into one and then let you unpack them like you so magically do. One is, you make a point in your book of the fact that you were in rehab, and unlike the other attendees there, you went to every single session and you took advantage of all of those. So I want to talk about the advantages of that and your decision to do that. And then also transition into, at the end, you give a lot of information on topics such as PTSD, such as dealing with sexual trauma, some of those areas at the end of the book. And I would love some insight into your thought process about providing that into the book. And then, of course, I do know you have another book coming. So we definitely need to make sure we give a teaser for another book, as well as a teaser for some of the unique types of therapy that you found and enjoyed at rehab. So can you start unpacking some of that,
Yeah,
Josh?
let's unpack. So I wanted to be, and again, we talked about it already, Craving Recovery. I wanted to be in rehab. I knew going in, I've got to do this. If I'm going to be around for my kids, I got a long life ahead of me. If I stop, if I get the help, I wanted to try to do everything I could. So my facility was a little different, and you and I have talked about this, Ange, where my facility was really about holistic healing. Find some of the tools that you can use, whether it's acupuncture, sound therapy, and things like that. And a group, they had the normal groups and all those types of things. We had AA speakers come in. We attended AA meetings. We did all that kind of good stuff. However, I was the only one. There were times where at group sessions, I was the only one in this entire house. And there was, a dozen or so people that would show up to meetings. A lot of the folks were there because their family forced them to be. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want the recovery for themselves. I took down phone numbers of a lot of these folks and called them afterwards after a couple of months of being there. They're back into their old habits. Oh, I couldn't wait to get home. I couldn't wait to get out of there. Some of them were younger, forced by their parents. Some of them were there because it was court ordered. Some of them were there because they had an intervention. Their family said, we can't take this anymore. You got to go. They didn't want to go. They were there because, okay, fine. If I do this, will you get off my back for a month? Yeah, cool. That's not the purpose and the intent of being there. If you want it, you've got to do the work. So I went to all the meetings. I did the sessions. I asked a lot of questions. During the downtime, I would go into the house manager's office and just chat with him and pick his brain. I'd talk to the people at night. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, because I couldn't have alcohol to kill my thoughts. So I'd wake up at 2:00 in the morning and go talk to the ladies in their office and pick their brain on recovery and what can I do differently? What have been the best practices of people that have made long-term success out of recovery? And so it was important to me to do that. Look, if you're just going there to appease somebody, why go? You're just spending tons of money because we know recovery is not free, unfortunately. Now, recovery is free. Treatment is not. If you're going to get the treatment from a medically observed detox, it doesn't. Now, there are some nonprofits out there that do allow for that, but they're also not going to have the type of facility that has the extras and all the ancillary things that my recovery center did, which was different types of therapy. Going back to the book, as you mentioned, I talk about PTSD. I talk about shame, the stigma, shame and guilt, stigma surrounding things. I talk about a lot of different, it's part 3 of my book, which really is just a topic on numerous items. I thought it was important to not just talk about my experience in life afterwards, but try to give some tools. Finding the right rehab. What's an IOP versus inpatient? What are all these types of things that you can do to help yourself? I wanted to give practical tools for people to, when they get out of rehab, how do I live my life? The biggest issue that I have, and I was telling you, I was talking at a recovery center last week, is people looked at it and said, I don't know what to do when I get the hell out of here. What am I going to do? Who do I talk to? Is there a meeting I need to go to? I don't know what to do. And so as I pointed out earlier, I like to share my story. I literally go in there and on a whiteboard, that's the first thing I do, as I write my name and phone number. I said, my biggest problem is when I got out, I didn't have a person to call. You got to have that resource. You've got to have somebody. I've gotten tons of calls. I had a call just a week ago of somebody that said, look, I'm drunk right now. I'm drinking tequila as we're talking. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. And we had to keep going through it. You've been only out for 2 days. How is this possible? I didn't say that, of course. I get it. I understand. But people need to have tools. And, the thing that I like about Recovery Advocate Network is it stands for a lot of different things. One, I'm kind of paraphrasing the website when it says something along the lines of much of mainstream society still harbors antiquated perceptions of what exactly it means to be diagnosed with mental health or have trauma, process disorders, substance abuse, and sexual identity challenges. In my day job, I work for a global firm that has over 400,000 employees, and I'm senior ambassador of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's very close and personal to me. So when I look at your organization, being inclusive means proactively raising awareness and normalizing conversations around whether it's mental health or substance abuse because the stigma still exists. Research absolutely tells us that the fear of discrimination hinders many people from talking about their problems, about mental health, about confusion to their gender, perhaps. And a huge benefit of inclusivity, and specifically this type of podcast, is that it provides opportunities for people like me to share their personal experiences. And that's what's key, because it can lead to a better understanding of addiction, recovering, overall healing. And in many cases, as it was with me, people may not have been exposed to the realities of addiction, recovery, or any of this type of stuff. And they have, and my wife did. They have misconceptions that are rooted in their lack of exposure to these issues. And look, it's not always easy to change people's perspective, but it may be possible when you have a chance to hear from people who are directly impacted by recovery, trauma, addiction. My wife, as a perfect example, is a perfect person to talk to. And she does. She talks to people and, about recovery. She's a huge proponent of my book. When she has a lot of clients that she deals with that say, oh gosh, my mom's not, we got this book and I'll buy it first. And then they got it for their mom. But really, when people are able to share their stories, share their tools, it can enhance the conversation on addiction and recovery. It also provides the opportunity to educate others who were previously unaware of the struggles faced by people with addiction in the communities that they're in. And again, going back to inclusivity, by including everyone, we can break down these misconceptions and ensure people have an accurate understanding of addiction, mental health issues, trauma, sexual identity challenges, and so on. Your last point was, and I'm unpacking everything, Ange, that I thought you gave to me. The last point was holistic healing methods at the facility that I went to. And I think I have an idea of where you're kind of going to on this one. And that was wolf therapy. And correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I know you're pointing at me right now.
It's totally wolf therapy. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I tease this in my book quite a bit. You can certainly read more about it in the book, but I bring it up throughout the book. They say, okay, hey, Thursday is going to be wolf therapy. And I was like, what the hell are you talking? Wolf therapy? Like a real world wolf, or is the big bad wolf? What's going on here? You're going to read a book? No, we actually have wolves coming. I'll be brief on this. There's a relationship between humans and wolves that's really kind of a primal bond that dates back thousands of years. And at some point along the line, it's kind of encoded in our DNA, as it was explained to me. But really what they do is we all sit around and they bring these wolves ambassadors out. And, they're calm, playful, and often mostly shy. But we have this skewed perception based on cultural bias. And it goes back to the point that we're making here, that wolves are scary. They're the big bad wolf. They're going to blow your house down, all this type of stuff. So we have this idea that oh my gosh, they're so scary, until you meet them and you realize that they're just like us. They have this feeling about themselves that they're to be feared. They're not to be feared. They're vulnerable. We have these preconceived notions that are surrounded by wolves, and the interactions, ultimately we come to realization that it's our job to carry the message forward of recovery to the communities. And the interaction with wolves helps us dispel some of the preconceived notions that we have surrounding them, that they're really not that scary. And thus, alcoholics are really not that scary. People that have issues of not knowing their gender or being confused or having challenges around that, or somebody that is bipolar or whatever it may be. And I have bipolar as well, so I take medication for it, but they're not that scary. They're just like you and I. The problem is you don't know about it. You don't understand it. You may have your own issues that you don't talk about, that you keep behind closed doors. If I can come out and share, maybe you're willing to share and learn too.
Love, love, love it. And we have our episode of someone, Sarah shares her story of opiate addiction that started at the age of 7, treating for migraines. I also think there's such a huge stigma of thinking that there are these addicts that one day said, hey, guess what? I want to be an addict. That does not happen.
Yeah, I didn't grow up. That wasn't my childhood dream, Ange. I wanted to be a football coach. I didn't say, God, I can't wait till I could start drinking myself to sleep every night and drinking, a fifth within 2 minutes between 11:45 and midnight. That's not how I grew up.
Yeah, you didn't grow up and say, hey, I want to check into a rehab center where they have to take all of my stuff away and tell me what time I have to do everything.
Yeah, they have to wash my clothes day one just to make sure I didn't sneak something into my collar.
Yeah, no, wasn't on my bucket list either. So yeah, I'm very excited. And thank you so much for the shout out on the organization. I'm very passionate about everything you said. And so my heart just was swelling from that. So I'm very grateful for that. So why don't we do a couple of things? One, why don't we give a teaser about the book that you're working on? And then it is mandatory if you're on this podcast to share your favorite motivational 1 or 2 quotes. So let's do both of those.
Okay. Well, look, when I was done with my first book, I sent it to the publisher and they started looking at it. And she said, there's 2 other books here. One, you talk about your experience, but you also talk about who you are and who you aren't, or who you think you want to be. And so in keeping with the Craving Recovery theme, the next book is, and I just finished my last page last week, so we got a ton of editing and ton of stuff to do behind that, but it's called Craving Identity, Removing the Mask of Normalcy. Oftentimes we wear this mask where we don't have our mask of truth on. We have a mask of normalcy where we try to fit in, we try to be normal, we try to act the way society wants us to act. And that isn't practical. So I talk a lot about my identity as an alcoholic, my identity as the pros and cons of labeling people. I talk about the sexual abuse victim and survivor identity, my depression identity, alcoholic and suicidal identity, and then talk more about, and look, I go into other things too, lying identity, my ghosting identity, not calling people back, all that kind of stuff, procrastinating and things like that. But I also go into self-acceptance, self-love, self-worth. And these are all kind of encapsulated in, you've got to be true to yourself. And you've got to take that mask of normalcy off and really replace it with that mask of truth so people can really understand. And part of this is not just for me, for my being, it's for others. And like I mentioned, Ange, how thankful I am for a podcast like this and the organization of RAND, so we can actually get out there and expose, God, we're not scary people. It's okay. Let's talk about it. The more normal people try to act, the more fearful they are that somebody's going to get into our life. I'm going to share something with you, and I do this because, and I do this quite a bit. My wife and my cousin, who's one of my best friends, asked me following, coming out and talking about my abuse. And I share this because I think it's important for people to understand. And matter of fact, part of this will be in the new book about how I felt after my abuse, years of not talking about it. And I felt, and I'm going to wing it a little bit here. I hate it when people say, hey, I'm going to wing it, because I always say, well, would you like it if your dentist winged it? No. So, but I'm going to wing it right now. Look,
go for it. I wing it all the time. Yeah, so just cool. Go for it.
I often felt like I was stranded. This is how I felt after my sexual abuse and all these decades. I often felt like I was stranded on an island, all by myself. But I could see the mainland and I could see everybody over there, friends, my family, everybody was there. It looked like it was pretty crowded on the mainland, but I imagine they all lived in this joyful little happy world that they understood, that they trusted, they belonged to without a worry in the world. And they all seemed to feel safe and secure. Now, I looked around, I was on this deserted island. I seemed to have only me, stuck alone with my thoughts by myself. And being that I could still see my family and friends on the mainland, I would yell out to them frequently. I'd say, hey, I would scream out and wave my hands, hey, 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 I'm jumping up and down, trying to get your attention. I'm gesturing like a madman, like I'm doing right now, that the audience can't see. But I can't seem to reach them. At other times, I search the island for a boat. Maybe there's a bridge over there somewhere to the mainland. And I spent a lot of time searching for it, but I can never seem to locate it. There are times, however, on that mainland, they hear me, see me waving. All they do is wave back. And then they go back to their lives. They think I'm just fine over here on the island by myself. I'm just being cordial by waving. They don't recognize that I'm over there screaming out for help. And when I scream loudly, it gets silenced not only by the distance, but by the huge, terrifying waves that are between the island and the mainland. And often I feel rather tired. I'm jumping up and down all the time. I'm screaming out, to the mainland. So I take a seat on the sand, feel sorry for myself. I stare across the ocean and watch them from afar. After all, because I have memories of what it was like to be on the mainland, because once upon a time I lived there safely too. I shouldn't think about it as it only makes the thunderous and kind of crashing loneliness of my island harder to bear, but I find it difficult to block myself from reminiscing rather bitterly about how it was when I was over there, because how I once trusted people, how wonderful it was to be comfortable among people and feel connected to people in my life and to the world. And when I sit on that shore and I look across, I wonder how the actions, and this is how I look at it today, Ange, I wonder how the actions of this child predator brought upon my exile to this island. There's a child predator living happily and contently on the mainland. They don't understand how much of a threat he is, yet I'm the outcast. He can freely include himself amongst them because they don't know the truth, partly because I never said anything. He was never caught, never admitted to anything. However, I know the truth of what was done to me, the actuality of the trauma, the indisputable, reprehensible nature of it. And knowing this separates me from my friends and family because they don't know. And due to the stigma attached with sexual abuse, society in general would prefer that I even forget this even occurred, as it could disrupt the order of things. It could make life difficult for people other than me to hear it all. So this is how I explain it to people, why I kept it inside, how I felt when it was kept inside. Yes, I screamed out, I yelled, I wanted help, but I did it internally. That's why I numbed myself. That's why I found what I felt were the coping mechanisms of alcohol, suicide, all those other types of things that I did, was to heal myself so I wouldn't feel the unbearable pain anymore. Now, the new book goes into all these different components and why the stigma around those, as an example, I'll just tease on this: suicidal identity. It's selfish, people say. You're in it. How can you do that? It's not selfish. I can't handle the pain anymore. I'm not even thinking about you. I'm thinking about myself completely. And trust me, there is a lot of thought that goes into other people when people attempt suicide, but yet people still feel it's selfish. So there's a lot of different things in this new book that I touch on because I think it's important. And yes, I give the tools. But like anything, the story that I just told, I tell a lot of stories in this new book. I begin each and end each chapter with a story. It's fictional in a lot of respects, but I think it helps relate some bearing on what the topic is. Whether it's removing the mask, whether it's, hey, I attempted suicide, whether it's I'm depressed, or whatever the topic may be, it's important to make sure you kind of relate that in a way that's relatable to other people.
I'm going to interject here because I am so happy you just made the comment about suicide and selfishness, and maybe I'll get some unfavorable reviews for these comments, but I agree 1,000%. I get so frustrated when I hear that, because I have said to my doctors, my therapist, back when I had such debilitating nightmares from my kidnapping and went so long with zero sleep. And I said, there is a reason sleep deprivation is used in war for torture. And no one deserves to go and live under that level of agony. And to tell someone that you're being very selfish in that way is awful. And I know I myself have an amazing daughter who is the best thing that I've ever created on this planet. And I love her to death. And yes, in those hard times that she did keep me going as well. However, to hear that selfishness thing, it was always a sting to me, because I just made me realize that everyone who said that to me as that being the reason that I needed to stay alive didn't get it. They didn't understand the pain and agony. And that was not the answer that was going to allow me to heal and allow me to be my best self. And so
Yeah, I
want
agree.
to
And
say that.
yeah, it's so important, look, and I've been asked this many times, oh, you didn't even try to get help. Look, individuals that think about suicide, and mine started out very passive before they turned active. In a lot of cases, people reserve suicide as their last resort, their final option, when every other option in their world has failed. They've attempted to speak to therapists, they've tried to get help, and something lights that final little match. And then it turns into an active situation. It's no longer passive, and they do something. I spent a lot of time. Matter of fact, it's the longest chapter in my next book. Why? Because if I was successful in my suicidal attempts, and I was hospitalized after several of those, if I was successful, I wouldn't be able to write the book. So I dedicate the book to that portion for those people that have survived their attempts. And thank God that they have. And thank God I did. But look, there was so much pain, I couldn't take it anymore. And it's a very much a taboo topic, as is child abuse and all that type of stuff. If we don't talk about it, things don't get resolved. I solely wish that I would have heard these stories 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, been able to go, that's me. Oh my gosh, how did he get through it? What did he do? And that's why I want to have tools in the book to be able to talk about, here's what you can do next step. There's advocates, there's people that can work for you, that can help you. There are nonprofits that will be involved if you're short on cash and you don't have the means to get the help that you need. And that's why groups like yours are so important, not just for us to share stories. We can be storytellers and do all this kind of good stuff. That's great. But really to provide practical tools for people to get the help that they deserve.
Absolutely. And the community to say, you're just not alone. You're absolutely not alone. Find your tribe. So tell us your motivational quote.
Well, look, in rehab every single day, and most of the book Craving Recovery is based on rehab. And I wrote down this quote. There was a book of quotes, motivational quotes, laying next to my bed in rehab. And every day I'd write a different quote, and I'd put one in every single chapter. And the one that I saw first that rang so true to me, by Nelson Mandela, and it states, there is no passion to be found in settling for a life that is less than the one you're capable of living. And it rings so true, because to me, this quote, it encourages people to absolutely refuse to settle for mediocrity in their lives. Rather, the quote suggests that true passion and fulfillment can only be found by striving to reach one's full potential. This means got to take risks, got to challenge yourself. And, one must embrace the opportunities to learn, to be educated, to grow and develop. All those last 4 little points that I made all occur within the recovery space. Got to learn, got to educate, got to grow, you got to develop. And that is really this quote. I think we can't just settle. We've got to live our best life. We get one. And it's so incredible to have the opportunity to speak to people like yourself, Ange, that have been through trauma in the past and have, still working on it. It's in AA, they say one day at a time. And I believe that sincerely. But I still have nightmares. I still have triggers as we talk about sexual abuse and suicide. I still have those triggers. My wife, again, Sasha, why is she so great? There's a program we'll watch, whether it's Law and Order or anything else. If it has something to do with a topic that might be sensitive to me, she asks, hey, are you okay watching this? That's the type of empathy we want. We want people in our world, in our surroundings, to be educated, to know, to learn, to develop these tools to help support people like myself, people like you, that have been through a lot of crap in their lives and help us live and be capable of living a life that is amazing.
I love it. And listeners, I'm internally so emotional because last night I recorded an episode with Scott from Motivated Mind. His favorite quote was the man in the arena, which Joshua, if you can see in the very back of my office, is that version of the quote. It's the woman in the arena version from Theodore Roosevelt. So it's hysterical. So then I was like, well, I happen to have your favorite quote on my wall. Now, you just gave Nelson Mandela's quote, and I don't know if you can see it, but on my dry erase board, you can't read it. But the third quote at the bottom is what you just read just now, written on my board.
Awesome.
So I just love to be blessed with like-minded individuals. So thank you for taking your time. I know you're super busy, and this is a sacrifice to spend some time and share your wisdom, your vulnerability, your transparency. Please make sure to send the links to me of how listeners can get information about your current book and your future book, and I will make sure to include them in the outro and in the show notes. Do you have any final parting words?
And first off, my pleasure to be here with you today. When we talk about this stuff, believe it or not, and most people don't understand unless you've been in a situation like me, this helps me more than it helps anybody else. And, being a little bit selfish on that, I love talking about it because it helps me realize that if I can help one other person beyond myself, then I'm not being so selfish. So I love to be able to talk about it because it does help me. Just like sponsoring some of the guys that I work with, it helps me equally as it helps them. So thank you for hosting and doing all the good work that you do, and keep it up.
Thanks so much. You just listened to episode number 26 with Joshua Young, author of Craving Recovery. You can learn more about Joshua and his upcoming books by visiting his website, www.joshuamyoung.com. I'll also include the information in the show notes. We hope you've been encouraged and learned something new from today's story. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any organization mentioned. RAN is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We also encourage you to comment on the episode so that we can continue to provide content that is most beneficial to the community. If you do, we'll give you a shout out. We are proud that every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. You can support the mission by clicking the love, not like, icon on our podcast and subscribing. We hope that you will also connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read our blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Rand Wellness. So, listeners, pause what you're doing, subscribe, follow us, please give us a 5-star rating, and provide some feedback. Finally, share these episodes with your friends. You never know whose hearts you'll touch. Be a part of the reason someone has new hope today. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're in the U.S. and need additional resources, such as shelter, support group resources, transportation, food, and/or a safe, confidential path out of physical and/or emotional domestic abuse, call 211 or visit www.211info.org for assistance. If you're in one of the other 20 countries that are not the U.S. and you're listening to this podcast and you have resources that you know about, please share them with us. You can email me at podcast@recoveryadvocate.network.org, and I would love to share those resources. Now, we know you're busy. We're really grateful you spent this time with us today. We hope you will definitely not miss episodes 2 and 3 of this series. Sasha is amazing. You're going to love her as well. So go ahead, relax, and back to your coffee.